Sometimes, the most beautiful chapters begin in the most broken sentences. This wasn't the story of a hero, nor a tale of fairy tale miracles. This was about a man, a pair of lost little girls, and a love that bloomed between cracked walls and second chances. If you've ever believed that family isn't always who you're born to, but who shows up when no one else does, stick around. This one is for you. If this story doesn't tug at your soul just a little, you might want to check if you still have one. Here on True Soul Stories, we don't do explosions or plot twists every 30 seconds. We do something much harder. We tell real, raw, human stories, the kind that sit with you long after the video ends. Love? Hope? Second chances? Yeah, we serve those in quiet doses, with a side of tears and maybe a miracle or two. So if you're the kind of person who still believes in kindness, connection, and healing that doesn't come with a punchline, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. The early morning fog clung low to the pavement, weaving around rusted mailboxes and empty fences on the edge of Harlow Springs. It was a kind of town where nothing changed, and yet everything slowly faded. Jake Monroe parked his old Ford pickup outside the back gate of the livestock auction, though he wasn't there for cattle. Not really. His shoulders bore the weight of years, his hands the calluses of silent work. A single father with too many bills and not enough sleep, he wasn't there to save anyone. Or so he thought. The rumors had come through hushed voices and backroom whispers that a woman had been offering children, real children, behind the barns after market hours. Jake hadn't believed it, not until he saw them. 2 girls, no older than 6. Identical, thin as reeds with matching strawberry blonde pigtails and bruises that looked too fresh for imagination. They sat on an overturned feed bucket, eyes cast down, hands clasped tightly. They didn't cry. That was the first sign something was wrong. Children that young, who didn't cry anymore? That meant they'd learned not to expect help. The woman, dressed in tight jeans and desperation, leaned against a fence post chewing gum like it paid rent. "They ain't mine," she said with a shrug when he asked. "My husband's first wife left him. I can't raise what ain't blood. You want him or not?" Jake's mouth went dry. He should have walked away. He had no business taking in 2 more mouths to feed when his mechanic shop barely broke even and his teenage son barely spoke. But something about those girls, the way one had inched her pinky finger over to touch the other's knee, a silent promise of protection, cut him to the core. So he said yes. He handed over cash. Not much, too much, enough to make him feel sick. And the woman disappeared without a name. He took the girls home in silence. No introductions, no questions. They sat in the back seat with their fingers laced and stared out the window as if the world was too big to look ahead on. Jake lived in a farmhouse that creaked like an old man's knees, peeling white paint, a swing that no one pushed anymore, the kind of place grief liked to settle into. His dog, Roscoe, an old hound with cataracts, sniffed the girls gently and curled at their feet like he understood things Jake couldn't name. The girls didn't speak for 2 days. Jake made grilled cheese and tomato soup. They ate in silence. He laid out quilts on the floor beside the fireplace, and they curled into each other like spoons in a drawer. On the 3rd morning, one of them pointed to the dog and whispered, "Roscoe." That was it, the beginning. Their names came later, or rather, what they chose to be called. Lily and Lark. He didn't know if those were real or made up. He didn't ask. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they finally smiled when he put cinnamon in their oatmeal. Days turned into weeks. Jake learned that Lily hummed when she colored, that Lark liked to stack rocks by the barn in even piles of 7, that they both screamed at night if the wind howled too hard. Trauma was silent language, but Jake was a good listener. His teenage son, Mason, came home on weekends from his job in the city and watched the girls like they were stray kittens that had invaded his life. But even he couldn't resist the way Lark called him Mace, and how Lily drew him holding a toolbox with a heart. The town didn't ask much. Harlow Springs wasn't the kind to meddle, but people noticed. Miss Grady at the diner slipped extra biscuits into Jake's takeout bags. Pastor Roy brought over puzzles. The world shifted quietly. Then, one night, Jake saw headlights in the yard. A black SUV. Windows tinted, engine running. He stepped onto the porch with a shotgun in his hand and his heart in his throat. The driver didn't get out, just stared, and then drove off. The next morning, Lily had a nosebleed. No reason, just a bright red drip that stained the pillow, and a fever followed. Then Lark cried in her sleep. Jake took them to the doctor, a gentle woman with a kind smile and questions Jake couldn't answer. She pressed gently and Jake told her what he knew. The bruises, the fear, the woman by the fence. Child services called the next day. Jake sat in the kitchen with folded arms while the social worker explained that the girls were reported missing, that their biological father had died overseas, and their stepmother had vanished with them months ago, that there was a bounty for information, and that someone had reported seeing them at the mechanic shop. Jake thought about lying, but he didn't. He told them the truth. The investigation came like winter, sudden, cold, unrelenting. They took the girls for questioning. Lark screamed. Lily clung to Roscoe. Jake watched them go with hands clenched into useless fists. The town rallied. Miss Grady called every reporter she knew. Pastor Roy started a petition. Mason, who had barely said 10 words to Jake in weeks, showed up and stood in front of the courthouse with a sign that read, "They belong home." And slowly, truth won. The girls came back, bruised but whole. The courts ruled in Jake's favor. The stepmother was arrested in another state with cash and a burner phone. Turns out, she'd planned to sell the twins more than once. Jake sat on the porch the night they returned, watching fireflies blink in the distance. Lily crawled into his lap. Lark handed him a picture. It was their house. The swing. Roscoe, Mason, him, and 2 girls in the middle with wide, hopeful eyes. Above it in messy crayon were the words, "Our everyday miracle." Jake didn't cry. Not then. He just held them and whispered, "I think you saved me, too." Sometimes, miracles don't come with trumpets or halos. Sometimes, they come in mismatched socks and whispered names in the quiet, relentless rebuilding of something that was never supposed to exist. If this story touched something in you, share it. Someone out there may need reminding that family isn't found. It's made. Subscribe for more true-to-heart tales that live in the spaces between brokenness and belonging. And tell us, where you're watching from. The sun rose slower the next morning, or at least it felt that way to Garrett. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, he had something worth waking up to. 2 little girls, curled like commas in the same bed, sharing warmth and dreams like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't want to wake them, but when Lily's small hand reached toward the morning light, and Ellie murmured something about pancakes in her sleep, he knew the day had truly begun. Garrett moved quietly through the kitchen, the sounds of sizzling batter and the smell of warm butter filling the air. The girls patted him moments later, barefoot and blinking, hair tangled like wildflowers. They ate without fuss, just soft smiles between bites, like they were settling into something real, something safe. It wasn't all easy. Ellie flinched at loud noises, and Lily had trouble falling asleep unless Garrett sat nearby, humming old tunes he didn't even remember knowing. But each day brought more laughter than tears, more quiet joy than pain. And every night ended with the same words from Ellie, whispered like a secret. "Thank you for finding us." Garrett didn't have much, but he had his hands and his heart. So he began fixing up the guest room, painting the walls soft yellow, the color of hope. He found a second-hand bookshelf and filled it with fairy tales and stories about brave girls who didn't need to be rescued, but deserved love anyway. On weekends, he drove them to the edge of town to watch the ducks or pick strawberries, little traditions slowly stitching a life together. But word travels fast in small towns. Whispers started, especially after the school enrollment paperwork asked for guardianship papers Garrett didn't have. A call came from the county office. Questions were asked. Faces he thought were friendly turned cautious. And then one cold Monday morning, a woman in a dark suit knocked on the farmhouse door. She introduced herself as Agent Meredith Cole from Child Protective Services. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was official, precise. She'd received an anonymous tip about 2 children being housed illegally on the property. Garrett's chest tightened. He offered coffee. She declined. The girls peeked around the hallway. But one look at Meredith's clipboard sent Ellie retreating back into the room, clutching her sister. Meredith asked questions: where he'd found them, why he hadn't reported it immediately, what proof he had that they weren't being trafficked. Garrett answered as best he could, showing receipts, the food journal he kept for their meals, even the medical records from their last checkup. Still, she took notes. A week later, she returned with a court order. Garrett stood on the porch as she explained they'd be placing the girls in temporary foster care until things could be reviewed. His knees buckled. The girls cried. Ellie screamed, and Lily clung to his shirt like a life raft. The officers weren't cruel, but they were firm. Garrett packed their small suitcase with shaking hands. As the car pulled away, Lily's face pressed the window. Garrett felt the most helpless he had since Sarah passed. He stood alone in the house that night, staring at the empty chairs, the crayon drawing still taped to the fridge. For a moment, he thought about giving up, letting the system do what it always did. But then he saw the stuffed bunny Lily had left behind, and something in him hardened. The next day, he walked into town. He talked to a lawyer named Dina Ward, who agreed to help pro bono after hearing the whole story. He visited the county records office, filed emergency guardianship paperwork, and found a local therapist willing to vouch for the girls' well-being. The court date was set. The day of the hearing, Garrett wore his cleanest shirt, ironed twice over. Dina sat beside him, confident and calm. The courtroom wasn't grand, but to him it felt massive, cold, impersonal. Then came the surprise. The judge called a witness to stand. It was Maria, the woman from the diner. She testified that she'd seen the stepmother leave the girls with the man who first tried to sell them, that she'd seen the way the girls lit up around Garrett, that this wasn't just a case of charity. It was love. Then another witness, the school secretary. She told the court how Ellie had cried when Garrett wasn't at pickup one day, how Lily drew pictures of our new dad and labeled their farmhouse home. And finally, Garrett himself spoke. He didn't say much, just what mattered, that he wasn't perfect. But he died before he let them go, that he didn't see them as a burden but a blessing. Silence followed. Then the judge looked at the girls, seated beside a social worker. He asked Ellie if she wanted to stay with Garrett. She stood up, walked over to the judge, and handed him a picture she'd drawn that morning. It showed 3 stick figures beneath a tree, 1 tall, 2 small, all holding hands. The gavel hit the bench. Motion granted. They were going home. The drive back was quiet, but charged with the kind of joy that doesn't need music. Garrett carried Lily in one arm, Ellie skipping ahead, the wind whipping her curls like a banner. When they reached the porch, she turned, looked at him, and said, "Now we grow old here, right?" He nodded. "Right." Spring arrived in full, with soft rains and wildflowers along the fence line. Garrett planted a small garden in the back. Ellie insisted on tomatoes. Lily wanted daisies. They painted the mailbox together, bright pink and orange, a masterpiece of chaos. Neighbors began to wave again. Some dropped by with casseroles. One even brought a swing set they no longer used. Garrett started writing again, just little notes, thoughts, things a girl said that made him smile. He kept them in a jar labeled Everyday Miracles. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Lily asked, "Were we ever for sale?" Garrett's heart clenched. He bent down and looked her in the eyes. "Not anymore," he said. "Now you're priceless." Later that year, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a check. Large. Enough to cover school, repairs, maybe even college one day. Tucked between the folds was a note in neat cursive. "Thank you for breaking the chain. For giving them what we couldn't." It was unsigned, but Garrett had a feeling. The twins never talked about their stepmother again. Not because they forgot, but because they no longer had to. The fear didn't rule them. Love did. On the first anniversary of their homecoming, Garrett took them to the hill behind the house. They released paper lanterns into the sky. One for the past, one for the pain, one for the miracle of being found. And when the last one drifted out of sight, Ellie whispered, "Now we're real." "Right." Garrett hugged her tight. "Now we're forever." If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to True Soul Stories. We share real feeling tales of hope, healing, and second chances, because sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the biggest miracle. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And remember, miracles often come wrapped in quiet moments, right when you least expect them.